Good to see y'all. My name is WRCA Cox. I know y'all are here to listen to these two men here. I'm really honored to be here with both Shannon Hall and Johnny Hill. They're two good men I admire immensely. I've known both of them for a long time, and they got some incredible stories. Shannon Hall, I'll just give you a little background information. Shannon Hall is really best known as a cutting horse trainer, but he's actually spent a long time in his life as a rancher, and his introduction to ranching came as a young man on a ranch called Lewis Ranches, or RO Ranch. And then from there he went on to win $4 million, or over $4 million in cutting horse competition. Won the cutting horse futurity on Shania C, and was that 1956?
1999.
1999.
I'm not that much of a legend yet.
Anyway, but from there he built a large cow-calf operation in southern Oklahoma, and his greatest passion, as I said, has always been to be a rancher. And how old were you when you came to the Lewis Ranches?
I was 11 years old the summer we went there. My mom and dad had divorced, and I was raised in the city. And we lived in the city with my mom. I was raised to believe that my stepdad was my dad. And my older brother and I were watching television in Amarillo one night, watching the news, and a cowboy came on the television. My mother watched that for a few minutes, or my brother did, my older brother did, and then he asked my mom, said, "Who's that guy on TV?" He was 13, I was 11. And she looked at him for a minute. She said, "Well, that's actually your father." So the first time I saw my dad, I was a young boy, 10 years old actually at the time, had hair about halfway down my waist, and I was the furthest thing from a cowboy anyone in this room could be. And my brother, I believe through direction of God, recognized my dad, and so that was the first real live cowboy I can remember seeing that night on TV.
Yeah, and I think what really brings us together really well is when you came to the ranch, Johnny Hill was there, and you had been on the ranch since you were about 20 years old. And I'll tell you all about Johnny Hill here. He started on the ROs in 1972, and you were just a local farm kid that started working there, and you really learned a lot about cowboying when you were there.
Yeah, I learned a whole lot about cowboying when I was there. I didn't know enough to get out of the way when we first started. I got to work with some really good guys and really good teachers. They might not say anything, but if you watched them, they would show you what you need to do and how to do it.
Yeah. One thing else about Johnny, I'll tell you, I know he wouldn't tell it. The very first ranch rodeo that was held was in Wichita Falls in 1981. It was the Texas Ranch Roundup. And ranches like the Wagners were there, 4-6s, Pitchforks, a lot of big ranches, but Lewis Ranches actually won that very first inaugural ranch rodeo in Wichita Falls, and he was on the team. And then in 1984, you were top hand, and then in 1983, I'm back and getting out of order here, but 1983, Lewis Ranches won that ranch rodeo also. And then you were also on the top horse at the Texas Ranch Roundup in 1988.
1987.
1987, I'm sorry. So yeah, so it's neat. These two guys I think you've been a big influence on Shannon's life. Y'all have remained good friends for so long. And would you mind kind of telling me your recollections of Shannon when you met him as a young man?
It's hard to say until his daddy got his hair cut off and they come to stay down there. He was pretty high-tempered than the rest of it one time. I saw Daddy Party out running in a foot race, and maybe Daddy couldn't understand it. Then he was an old guy at the time. But he's always had lots of desire, is what I call it, and you don't give up. He does what he starts out to do. I mean, I've seen him ride lots of horses that most folks didn't want to.
Yeah. What were some of your, go ahead.
Well, my first memory of working with Johnny Charles, and understand I came out of the city, and not just from the city to the country, but I came from the city and instantly got horseback and went to trying to keep up with him and my dad, who's two of the wildest things on a horse you ever tried to follow. But one of my first memories of Johnny Charles is he and my brother and my dad were working some cows up on heel at a set of pins, and if I remember right, this cow took off down the fence, and Johnny Charles, he went to head her, and about the time that cow turned back, his horse started to turn back, and then he decided he'd buck Johnny Charles off right there. And he hit the ground like a sack of cake coming off a windmill tower. And my dad, he's about as patient as I was, and he's just going to go and keep working around it. I kept looking down and I said, Daddy, Johnny Charles ain't moved yet. He'll get up in a minute, he'd say, and he watched the cows, boy, and we're still going at it. And you laid there for a while.
It hurt. Big time. I've been bucked off more than anybody I know, I imagine, and very few times did it actually hurt, but that just nearly paralyzed me. Next day, my leg was swelled up where I couldn't put my britches on. If that tell you anything.
All I know is he was still my hero, but I wasn't sure I wanted to be just exactly like him after that moment.
When you came to the ROs, you told me earlier about how you were really impressed with the way they worked cattle. They had, can you explain the situation, how they had a bunch of different brands and the way they brought cattle together?
Well, Johnny probably explained it better than me, but I've often said I was privileged to watch him and my dad, Jiggs Man, Horace McClellan, Harley Long, and all those guys that worked there when they worked the Roundup. They actually had, what, 6 brands or 5 or 6 brands?
7 brands.
7 brands. And when I first moved there, they still mammied up every calf to his mama and drove them to the cuts, and you held each cut until they were done working Roundup, and then you started branding. Well, guess where the city boy on the old gentle horse was at? He was on the farthest set of cuts out there, and about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you got to drive yours in and help brand while they was all up there. But even then, watching those guys, I was so intrigued. I guess, the Bible tells us that the gifts and talents of God are irrevocable. And I guess God put a desire in me for a cow horse. Because even as a city kid, just learning a new environment, I was so intrigued watching you guys work around up and watching those horses do things that just amazed me. And I was privileged, I've often said, to probably get to work on one of the closest environments to what the open range was actually like in my lifetime.
Yeah, I had Frank Garrett was the manager for Lewis's, and he was about as kind and patient man as you ever see. He had to be put up with me. But first time, I didn't know, we held around that together, I didn't know what they was doing. Didn't have a clue. I asked Mark Allen, I said, what are they doing? He said, they're working in a hurry. Oh, I didn't know. Anyway, Frank sent me out there to hold the cut, just like he did you. Those old Hereford cows had been worked so much that when they come together, they'd get their calf and they'd start looking for the cut that they was going to because they knew they were going somewhere. And then later on, Frank put me in there doing some work. Told me to go cut dry cows out one time. At that time, I didn't know a dry cow from a billy goat. And he put me in there. I rode in there and sat there a minute looking around and was looking at a cow, and I was pretty sure she was dry, but I didn't want to call that. Frank rode by me and said, looks dry to me, and that's all he ever said. So I just had to go to work.
I'll tell you how much that influenced me. When I started training cutting horses, and then I had clients from all over the United States, from Los Angeles to Chicago to Augusta, Georgia, you name it. At one time I had people from all over the world that came and took cutting lessons at our barn. And what I learned was the greatest way I could teach those people was in the fall when we started selling our calves, when I was blessed enough to own my own ranch and my own cattle, we'd mammy those steer calves up with their mamas and the heifers with their mammies, and we'd put them in different pastures to ship them. And I learned right away some of those guys that were struggling just making cuts in the arena to show their horse, maybe they rode really well, but their adrenaline would get to going and they'd get in a hurry. So I started, and actually Western Horseman did an article on this that I was doing at the time. I believe you did that article in Western Horseman, didn't you? That I'd take those guys out there and I'd teach them to mammy that calf up with his mama and then drive her to that cut. And as any cowman in here knows, you don't get in a hurry when you're doing that. And when I could teach those city folks to mammy a calf to his mama and drive that pair to their cut, then they walked back in that arena and they said, boy, this cutting these yearlings in this little arena is easy, isn't it? And I'd say, yeah. So that's how much that influenced me, even way up 25, 30 years later.
Yeah. Well, I learned a lot, that's all I can say.
What would you say, Johnny, what kind of impact did that make on training horses when they were doing jobs like that?
Well, a horse he sees what he needs to do, he's got a job. And if you'll help them just a little, pretty quick they'll pick it up on their own, and you don't have to work so hard.
Yeah.
But they're incredible creatures, and they're really smart if you give them a chance.
You were talking to me earlier about your horse Casey, and that's the horse that was the top horse you had.
Yes, sir.
And what you were just saying reminded me of something you said about that horse. How when you were working herd with him, I think you're talking particularly when you were in ranch rodeos and you were doing the team pinning. That horse was so intuitive that you'd look at a cow and he knew. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I've never seen a horse quite like him. I rode him 18 years and I never got on him that he didn't hump up. He bucked me off once and I rode him once and I figured out I'd talk him out of it because I couldn't ride. But it was 2 years where I had two horses that were really tough and I rode them nearly every day. And on him, I got where I'd get over next to the fence and scoot everybody over and I'd let a cow run off down the fence and make him go turn. Well, pretty quick you'd have to put your hand over his eyes or he wouldn't let him out. But then he got so in tune with what I was doing, I hardly ever had to pick up a bridle. And when the team pinning come along and got popular, I could look at a cow, and I don't know how he knew it, but he knew which one I was looking at, and he'd put her out of there. He was pretty phenomenal, I thought.
Casey was an outstanding horse, and obviously he won top horse on him, and a lot of y'all that were there remember what a great horse he is. But my favorite memory of that horse Casey is we was working cattle at Sandy Camp, where Johnny, the country he took care of for Lewis's. And we left there one morning in the dark, and it was darker than midnight under skillet, and we had to ride through some trees up there by your house. And we hadn't ridden very far, and it's dark, you couldn't see a horse's head, and you sure couldn't see Johnny Charles up there, because there was probably 15 men, paired up, trotting in the dark. And all of a sudden, up there in the front, you can hear, oh, oh. And then Johnny Charles says, Casey, you sorry son of boom. That was the end of it right there. Casey went off in the dark, and we ended up having to go get you a different horse, and you caught him that afternoon, I guess. But that's my favorite Casey story right there.
I had two kids right behind me. If they'd have been keeping up, that wouldn't have happened. But I rode him further than anybody thought, but you couldn't see. Every time he hit the ground, he's looking a different direction. He turned off the road, he was going down the road, turned off the road down a cow trail, and I could see some big old hackberry limbs coming up, and I knew I wasn't going to get through there. Well, I throwed my leg over to get off, and he hit me in the backside with that saddle, and I went about 10 foot in the air and hung my foot on the limb coming down. It fell on my back. He run off with a new saddle, of course. And I had left another horse in the pen because I was afraid that might happen. I went back and got the other horse, and I left Shannon's dad, Donnie, there. I said, would you go look for him? I said, I don't want them horses chewing that saddle up. Well, he caught up with us later. He said, well, I went and jingled the horses, but he wasn't with them. But he said, he did come in later. He said, your bridle was gone. Well, that evening I walked back down there where he bucked me off, my bridle was laying right there about where I was. He wasn't just playing.
Well, he may have rode him quite a ways, but he must not have started bawling until he was about done bucking.
I don't know. I don't know about that. He could buck though, and he could stop and turn around about as good as any horse I ever saw.
Yeah, as incredibly tough as he was such a talent, and he's the horse you rode, like we said before, is the horse you won the top horse on. What horse, I remember you said you were really proud of that, more than your top hand award, and a lot of it had to do with the person that you beat.
Yeah, well, King Ranch was there, and Welch was repping for him. Welch was there 3 years, and he won top horse twice on a horse called Enchilada.
Yeah.
And Casey beat him the other year, and I was more proud of that than I was being top hand. That was saying something. That there's some people who woke up and look around and see what she was riding.
Yeah, enchilada, I, of course, was blessed when I got into cutting to become, Buster Welch was one of my dearest friends, and I miss him dearly today. But if you beat him at anything, you'd accomplish something. I'll tell you, enchilada was as good an all-around horse as ever walked. He was a good one.
Well, the judges saw it that way that one time. I couldn't do it again.
You spent a lot of time training horses, both for the ROs and afterwards, and we talked a little bit earlier about horsemanship, and you were saying some really interesting things about the way you learned to work with a horse and the way you got through to it. Can you kind of talk about some of that a little bit?
Well, when I first moved to Sandy, they had several horses around the ranch, 3 and 4 years old, went in hard, but they'd bring them up there, part of them, they didn't bring them all, but they brought part of them. First thing I did was go and run them in the bronc pen, rope them on horseback, and choke them down and get a stake hat more on them, and drag them down there and tie them to a stake block. And drag them back the next day, tie a foot up, get your saddle on them, get on and off of them 3 or 4 times, get on and turn their foot loose and see what they do. Got pretty interesting sometimes, especially when you're there by yourself, you know. But later on I got a little wiser, and one of the better things that I ever did, and this is several years later, was I went to a lay hunt clinic, and we actually went to 2 of them, and that done me more good than anything I ever did as far as training horses. I got to ride a lot of horses. A lot of them, most folks wouldn't want to ride. But some of them turned out, some of them didn't.
And one of the things you said you learned from Ray, and maybe also some of it on your own, I don't know, but you learned about how, you know, you teaching a horse a lesson or teach them to do something, you always kind of try to leave him in a better spot than he was. And you also talk about when you were work with young horses, branded calves or dragon calves to fire, how you got them to have the confidence that they did. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I tried to never put a horse in a position where he thought he was losing. Because that's not good for their mind. If you started colt dragging calves, of course I usually go all them around the house, let them know what it is. And drag 3 or 4 little calves, and then go drag one just a little bit bigger, and then go back and drag another little one, and then quit while he's in a good frame of mind. And I never had a horse that wouldn't pull. And I've had some horses that pull the horn out of your saddle. But I tried not to put them in a losing position.
You know, one of the things that I so admired about Johnny Charles and my dad, and I brag on my dad because he's my dad, but they were both good hands with a horse nobody else wanted, whether they were bad to buck, bad to run off, or just some consider them no count. My dad and Johnny Charles both could take those and make something of them. I remember a horse, you called him Wichita, and I think if I remember right, y'all named him that because of the rodeo. You know, Wichita was a dang sure buck, and Wichita had made the rounds. He actually had left Lewis's for a while, and a couple other guys had tried him, and he ended up back at Lewis's, and Johnny Charles got him and made a darn good horse out of him. And when I was in college, I started the coach for Lewis's one year, and me and my good friend Rodney Barbie from Beaver, Oklahoma, anybody in here know Rodney Barbie? Know he also was as good a cowboy as there ever was. And Rodney and I became best of friends in college, and so we started these coach for Lewis's. We just ridden them about twice, and we wanted to take them to Sandy Camp where Johnny was at because he had a lot of creeks that were deep and sandy. And we wanted to go down and ride, and he said, yeah, y'all come on, I'll go with you, we'll have fun. So he loads Wichita up. By this time, he had him riding around pretty darn broke. And so Rodney and I took these broncs down there, and we got in the creek, and Johnny Charles gets on Wichita, and this creek had a bank about that tall. And he just backed up close to that creek, and he's poking fun at Rodney and I the whole time. And I told Rodney, I said, well, I've only ridden them a couple of times, let's just cheek them. Because my dad taught me, just like he said he learned, you just tied your foot up and got on them, and away we went. And that's what they had about twice. So I told Rodney, I said, let's just cheek them and get on them. and we'll just point them down the creek and Johnny Charles would go with us. So we cheeked them and stepped on. Well, as we stepped on together, my horse broke in two and he bucked a pretty good circle around there. I rode him, but he bucked my hat off. And my hat hit there in the creek, so Rodney stopped his coat kind of stayed right there, because I didn't know what his was doing while mine was bucking. I don't even know if he ended up getting on or not. But
he never did get completely on.
he didn't get plumb on. So I got mine stopped, and Rodney reached down and picked my hat. The whole time, Johnny Charles is cackling like a little hen over there. He thinks this is good watching. And sitting there, and the reins just drooped out there like Matlock Rose at the show cutting horse. And Rodney hands me that hat, and when I reach for that hat, that darn bronc booger, and he takes off, and Rodney's horse jerked loose from him and falls in there with me, and we're running right straight at Johnny Charles. And old Wichita's eyes are getting a little bigger the closer we get. And as we went by, Wichita bobs his head and goes to bucking, and the last thing I seen, Johnny Charles is perpendicular to the ground, parallel to the ground, spinning like a helicopter with old Wichita underneath him. And he comes off and it just drives his head in that bank, and I'm looking over my shoulder because we're running down this creek and fast the horse can run, but I didn't want to miss this because I know he's going to come off. When he hit that creek bank, his glasses must have went 30 feet right straight in there. Darnest thing you ever saw. And then them horses run for how long?
Forever.
They run for hours.
Actually, the horse that Rodney let get away was following his, and he steered his, and they got over across the creek up in the brush, and I could hear Shannon hollering his head off up there.
I was trying to stop that thing.
Me, Rodney and his horse finally turned and come back down, and my horse went down the creek, and
yeah.
we was walking down the creek going to catch him, and Rodney walked along, he kicked the dirt, and I know he was wanting to laugh, but he was afraid to. I mean, I've laughed at more people for getting ducked off than anybody, so I didn't care. But we got my horse caught and went over there and was walking up the road in that brush thicket. Here comes Shannon running, the horse come out in the brush and saw us down there, and he was coming to us. He won't from there. That other horse was chasing him all over.
I felt like we ran for 3 days out there waiting for y'all to show up.
Sounded like they tore down the whole thicket up there.
You talked earlier about how you and Donnie, Shannon's dad, had a lot of fun together, working together, and you remember that story that you were telling earlier about when y'all were working with that calf that y'all had you shackled it, and then you had the mama cow that was kind of coming after you, I think?
Yeah. Oh, Donnie and I had lots of fun. In the wintertime, you feed, you get through in half a day. And there was the country was really rough and really brushy, and you always miss the calves when you weaned in the fall, and we'd cook up some kind of deal to go catch some of them. And he called me one day on the CB and he said, "Hey, I got some cows across the river. Come help me this evening." I said, "Okay, I'll be down there." But I figured he's going to rope them, so I took a really good horse. And we slipped around, it's 2 cows and 2 calves. We found them on a little wheat field, and we messed around up there and caught those calves and tied them down. Of course, the cows run off. We went and hid, and the cows come back, but we caught them and shackled them. Went and got our pickups so we could load them. And I don't know if y'all remember or not, Donnie drug a cow to the fire at Wichita Falls on a big old bald-faced stock-legged horse one night. And that's the horse I was riding that day. He was really strong. Anyway, we got out there to load them cows, and Donnie said, "Would you jerk that cow down and I'll take the shackles off of him?" But I loaded by her and roped her. Old Payne, he went to the end of it and just kept going to the end of it, and directly that rope broke. It's a cold old day, and that rope hit me right behind the right ear, about knocked me off of it. Butted my ear all up, and Donnie got off on the ground and just laughed. He thought that's an area. I thought it hurt. We was into something like that pretty regular.
Yeah, my dad was a big prankster. I inherited a lot of that myself, and I know there's some gentlemen here that worked with me before I started training cutting horses. I had to the fun and privilege of working on several ranches in Texas and New Mexico, and there's some of those gentlemen I work with here today, and they probably would all attest to the fact that I inherited that prankster mentality from my daddy.
Yeah. He threw a green board at me one time and hit me where feller don't need to be hit, I promise. But a day or two later, we was in a branding pen. He finished up dragging. He was sitting on his horse, and I picked up a big old calf fry, pretty big one. Slung it across there, and it just went across there, and then just stuck right on his face. For about that long, he was a mad little fella. But I couldn't ask for a better friend. He stood by me when I didn't deserve it.
You talked also, I think it was when you were on Lewis Ranch, you learned to work a team. I think you were like 14 or 15.
Well, actually, and I love a team of horses, but I have to credit Walt Campbell and his wife Bobby's here today. Bobby, thanks for coming. Walt Campbell was another one of my heroes, and when I was about 14, we lived about a mile and a half south of the Prairie Dog Fork of the Red River, and Walt and Bobby lived at the Hickman camp, which was up the river several miles. And so I would ride a road course to the river and lead a bronc, and then when I got to the river, I would swap and I'd trot to the Hickman, and I'd usually spend the Saturdays. Walt would hitch a team. He had cake houses in all his pastures, and we put 100-pound gunny sacks full of cake. He'd get a semi-load in the barn, and then we'd take them and put them in that wagon on Saturdays, and I'd go help him fill those cake houses. And then through the week, Walt and Bobby would trot around those cake houses and feed their cows. And so Walt taught me to drive a team, and his teams usually consisted of two old renegade saddle horses that just were too dang rank to ride, and that's what he would break to work a team with. So usually your team rides with Walt could be pretty darn entertaining. I bet Bobby would have plenty of good stories there herself. But I just loved the team. I loved that. And then when I left the 4-6s, I went to the Barbie Ranch there with Stanley Barbie and Beaver. And he had a team of black mares. And he told me, he said, you can do whatever you want with that team. And that's all. Well, the whole time I worked for Stanley, I did everything with a team. I fed with them, fenced with them, and I don't know, I just always had a love for a team, and still do today. I still keep a team around and feed with them all that I can.
Have you ever done much with teams?
Never have. I remember riding in the wagon when my granddad was having maize behind the team, but I've never worked the team myself.
Yeah.
You know, when I started training cutting horses, two things I wanted more than anything. I wanted to own my own cows. I wanted to be able to ride out in the pasture and see my brand on the cow. And that's one of the first things I started working at. And I wanted to get a good team. And so one day I was looking through the Oklahoma City paper, and I showed my wife Rhonda. She's right here today with us, and I'm proud of that. And I saw this team for sale. Bail Bondsman in Oklahoma City had a black and white team, and he had a picture of them. And I thought, boy, those things are pretty. I'm going to go check them out. So we went to Oklahoma City, and this guy had them harnessed, and we hitched them to a wagon and drove them right through Oklahoma City, through all the big buildings and the cars, and they were just solid, best team. They were half paint and half standard bred, and they drove through the city just wonderful. So I bought that team, took them home. I drove them around, and I got to noticing around the barn and stuff, they were named them Will and James. And they're the prettiest black and white team you ever saw. And I drive around the barn and stuff, they were pretty good. But you'd get them outside, and then things were just a little snaky. And so I was trying to kind of work them down and get used to them. And Rhonda Whitney, my daughter Whitney, many of y'all know her, she was probably 2 years old, maybe less than that. And I told Mom, I said, hey, come with me on this new team. Let's go put out some in them. So I harnessed the team and hitched them. And we had to, where we lived, you'd go about a quarter mile to a dirt road and then a mile to Highway 81, which runs from Bowie, Texas to El Reno. It's a pretty busy highway, and it ran right in front of my first place that I owned there in Oklahoma. So when we turned and we had to cross this highway to get to this land I'd leased to run my cows. We turned and headed towards that highway, and I had a darn dog that was sorry dog, wasn't good for nothing. And this dog jumps a rabbit, and that rabbit run right between that Will and James, right down the middle, right under the tongue. and that dog's right on that rabbit's heels. Well, when he went out the front, Will and James decided this is a horse race and we're in on it, and away they go. And I mean, we're a sickening down this dirt road, and all I can see traffic coming, and I don't have time to worry about Mama. That's all I know, she's still back there somewhere. Well, this little wagon I had slats in the floor about that wide. And we get about 50 yards from the highway, and I decided I've got to do something. I had a pipe fence that run along the front of my place, and I thought I don't have to run them in that fence. These things are smoking. So I took the left line and just gave it all I had, and I got them just bent enough that they ran into that pipe fence and run the tongue through the fence and everything. And I looked back, and Mama had thrown Whitney down and laid down on top of her and had her fingers and toes stuck through them cracks, hanging on for all she was worth. And that wagon comes to a stop, and she jumps off, and she says, "You're stupid! You're the craziest human being I've ever known in my life." And starts to the house, and I backed them out of there, and she's walking to the house carrying that baby. And I said, "Mama, I think our harness is okay." And she wouldn't even talk to me. She just went right on. Yeah, I love that team, but I just had a hard time. I couldn't get them. I didn't have enough country back in those days to do what I needed to do with them. So I decided I'd use a little ace. I'd used it on a few of the horses I showed, and I thought if I take the edge off of James, then that'll just help me get him to where I'm handling a little better. And I had him about a year, maybe 2 years, and I hooked them to my manure spreader and spread my manure with Will and James. Well, one morning, my manure spreader, I parked it in front of the barn on a little incline about like that, and I hitched them to it. And just about the time I asked them to move, and I'd been working hard enough, I didn't use any ace on James that day. And when I asked them to move, I hear the hitch pin come out of that evener. And I look down, and sure enough, it pops out, and they take a step. Of course, when they step forward, that tongue slipped out of the yoke, so it drops to the ground. So now my wagon's starting to ease back, and they look back when that tongue dropped, and they left there. Well, I just hired a boy, Jason Birdwell. He worked for the Wagner Ranch, and one of the wildest dead-gun guys you ever saw, and he was a great hand for me, but he thought my cutting horse operation was the most boring place a cowboy could work. He's always telling me, "Boss, nothing exciting happens around here." And I'd say, "Well, Jason, these are high-dollar horses that we don't own. We can't afford to have wrecks around here." He said, "It's just boring all the time." He'd tell me that every day. Well, he just walked out of the barn when that tongue slipped out of that yoke, and them horses left there. But when they left and I stood up to grab them, I half-hitched that right line around my right wrist. And they jerked me off that manure spreader and take off up the gravel road dragging, and they're getting after it. Up ahead of me, the gentleman, Don Taylor, that supplied my cattle, had just pulled in. His pickup's parked about 15 feet off of a fence. Tied to that fence are about 8 two-year-old cutting horse prospects that people had paid anywhere from $30,000 to $75,000 a piece for. So we were headed up there to work, and that team drags me about 30, 40 feet till I get out of it, and I look up, and all I can see is that team running right straight at that gap between that pickup and those high-dollar horses. And I just said, "Lord Jesus, help me somehow." And as them horses ran, every one of them broncs snorted and turned, and they went right between them horses and never touched the one, hit Don's bumper and just put a little bit of paint on it. That's all it did. And they hit a pipe gate and knocked that pipe gate off the hinges, and they take off running towards Highway 81, just as fast as they can run. Well, I'm out there chasing them afoot, for what purpose I do not know, but I was after them. As they got close to Highway 81, I got a barbed wire fence there. James bumps Will. Will turns a somersault, breaks loose from him, goes through the barbed wire fence and slides out in the middle of Highway 81. James makes a big circle. Now I'm out in this trap chasing him, and he starts coming to me, running wide open, and I realize James wants my help, and I ain't going to be able to help him. So I take off and I run and jump back under the pipe fence. James hits the pipe fence and knocks him colder than a wedge, just lays him down right there. So I jump on his head. The whole time there's people, it's just chaos. I get on his head to hold him down, and I yell at the boys that work for me, "Go catch that other horse. He's running north, right up the yellow stripe on Highway 81. So they get in the pickup and take off after him. When they get to the top of Red Hill, which is just south of Minko, anybody from Oklahoma, you know where that's at, don't you, sir? They get to the top of Red Hill. There's an old man and a woman sitting there, stop, and Will has got his chest over their Cadillac standing dead still. And then boys said that old man and woman scared to death. They come back down there, and by that time, James, I get him on his feet, and I'll never forget Jason Burble says, "Hell of a wreck, ain't it, boss? Hell of a wreck." He just loved it.
What was the reason you said you didn't want to work with teams ever?
Well, I'll tell you, there was a boy worked for Johnson Ranch over at Allen Reed. Had a nice team of mules one time, and I don't know, I was talking to him at a rodeo or something, and he told me he was going to sell them mules. Well, I went up there and looked at them, and he had them priced pretty good. Had a nice wagon and a good set of harness. And told him I'd sure be interested. Well, I got home and got thinking about it. I thought, you know, if I buy them mules, Frank's going to come take them keys out of that pickup, and I'm going to have to use them. So I just left them alone.
I traded Will and James off the next day for a team of Belgians. And I've had Belgians or Percherons ever since. I stayed away from the paint horses after that.
The country I was on there, it'd take a while to feed it and pick up. I had 21,000 acres that I looked after, and the roads were bad and sandy. It's just hard for a horse to pull, you know.
You talked a little bit about Frank, and remind me of Frank's last name.
Frank Garrett.
Frank Garrett. He was the manager of the ROs back then when you were there.
He grew up there on the ranch.
What a neat man. I think it's worthwhile to talk about him a little bit, because he was a really neat person, the way he managed the crew. A very soft-spoken guy, wasn't loud or yelling. Can you talk a little bit about what impact he made on you?
Frank could chew you out royally, and then take you a week to realize that that's what he'd done.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a really good teacher. We had 5 camps, and if we were working in like my country, he told me what he wanted to do. He thought I was the boss that day. And working in somebody else's country, they were boss. They did the drive, they did, and he wouldn't tell you how to do anything. He'd tell you what he wanted done, and if it didn't work like he thought it ought to, he'd tell you, well, you might have done it like this. And he schooled on you, but you didn't realize he was schooling on you.
Yeah.
He was a phenomenal guy. Went to bed with the chickens every night, and he's at the office by 3 o'clock, had all the bills paid. If you sent him a bill, it was paid that day.
Yeah.
And he was really good to work for.
Your dad told a funny story about, I think it was him talking to Frank, and was it Shane sitting with him, and he was giving an example about how it took Frank so long to get something out of his mouth, or to get to formulate his words and just think about it. You remember that story very well?
No, I can kind of remember what you're telling me.
It wasn't you, it was Shane.
No, it was Shane, yes.
I thought that was Tim.
It may have been Tim, my youngest brother.
Was Tim.
Yeah.
But he was a young guy, and if I remember right, Donnie was sitting there and he'd ask Frank a question, and Don would sit back and just think forever and take forever, and whether it was either Tim or Shane, or like, just spit it out. Yeah. It just took forever.
Yeah, I know, Dad. I think anybody that worked for or around Frank Garrett realized what an extremely intelligent person, and after I became an employer and worked men, I realized how incredible he was with people. I was never that gifted. If you worked for me, I wished I'd have had some of Frank Garrett's talent handling people. But I think anybody that was ever around that man respected him tremendously.
Frank finished grade school, graduated 8th grade or whatever, and that's as far as he got. But I've seen him sit in that office, and Jeets would be running numbers on the computer, on the ad machine, and Frank could tell him the answer before that machine. I mean, he was sharp. He really knew how to handle people.
We mentioned Buster Welch a little bit earlier. We've been talking a little about your time in Oklahoma. You've worked cattle a bunch of different ways in Oklahoma, and I think there was a time that you remember with working cattle with Buster Welch in Oklahoma.
Yeah, Buster, like I said earlier, I miss him dearly. He was like a second dad to me, and I could spend all evening telling Buster Welch stories, and every gentleman, as many of you have many Buster Welch stories, I know, if you work around him, many of them have and did. But one of my favorite, as you know, his cows had probably spent more time on the truck than a JB Hunt driver. I mean, he sent those cows. If it got dry, he always told me you can haul a cow to feed cheaper than you can haul feed to a cow. And he'd send those cows everywhere, and he's called me almost every summer. He'd call me, Shannon, I'm drought out, can you find me some country? So we found him a couple places in Oklahoma. He found one, and I found the other. And so the one place he found was just about an hour northeast of me. And when it come time to brand those calves, he called me. He said, hey, can you take your crew up there and help us brand those calves? And I said, sure. So he came by that night. The next morning we got up early, went up there to this little place he'd leased. And when we get there, there's no place anywhere in visual sight where you could work them. And we didn't really have enough help to throw them up outside. So Buster said, well, just a minute. He got on the phone, and I don't have a clue who he called, but in about an hour, a guy shows up with 7 portable corrals. And he sets them up, and we pin these cows and calves in these portable corrals. Well, by the time we get them pinned, you can't walk through their foot. I mean, they're smashed in there just as tight as you could get a set of cows in that portable corral. And Buster looks at me and he says, tell you what let's do. You walk in there and catch those calves and just drag them out, and we'll work them and turn them loose, and then we'll work the cows as they come by us. He was just going to dope their backs, and he said, we'll dope the cows when we're done. I said, yes, sir. Whatever Buster said do, I was going to do. So I said, yes, sir. Well, you couldn't, there's no way to rope them. So at first I'd just ride up to the back and lean over with my rope and let one walk through it and then pull him out of there, and I just chipped away at it until I got enough room I could finally throw my rope. I drug them out of there, and we got them worked. Well, and about the time we get all the calves worked, and we just turn them loose outside this portable corral, there's just baby calves, as you can imagine, running and bawling and just all over this place. And then we started working the cows, and these old cows are running and bawling, and it's just, for any other human being, it would have been total chaos and would not have worked at all. But for Buster Welch, he came out smelling like a rose. That just seemed like the way things worked for him. So we get done and we go to eat lunch, and we're sitting there and we ate lunch, and I said, Buster, I want to tell you something. I said, you know, when I moved to Oklahoma from Texas, I knew I would work cattle like this. I just never thought it would be for Buster Welch. He just shook his head and he just smiled. He didn't even have an answer to it. But the Buster Welch stories, as many of you know, could go on and on. He was an amazing person that I was very blessed to get to spend a lot of time with.
Well, we're getting a little bit short on time here, but I think there's maybe one more thing we can kind of talk about. And to me, I think this kind of thing is just really special. I've been able, we read about stories about ranches and cowboys. We see television shows, but when you can just sit down and listen to people tell stories, real stories that happen, I think it's really neat. I think also what's so special about this industry is, the connections that we have with people, whether it be here within the industry or outside. I know that you've experienced that quite a bit, and so have you. And I think there was something you wanted to mention about how that.
Yeah, one of the most blessed things that I encountered when I chose to leave ranching and train cutting horses is the people that I met. I was blessed. The first part of my career, I was surrounded by cattlemen and ranchers. That's who sent me horses, because that's who knew me. Don Strain from South Dakota is a great cattleman and a good horseman, and sent me my first horses, and I still ride horses for his wife today. Billy Cogdill, I learned more about training a horse from Billy Cogdill and never saw him throw a leg over one because he had polio. But Billy Cogdill knew more about a horse than most people will ever know. He was just phenomenally connected to the horse, as was his brother D.M. I learned a lot originally from D.M. D.M. put me on my first horse that would actually work a cow. And I was just surrounded with people like those people that were ranchers, Monty Johnson. This goes on. Some of you may be in this room, and I'm so grateful for those people. But one of the most interesting things then was the people that I met outside of this industry, because we never want the Western life that we get to live. The fact that when you go to a rodeo, they still pray over that event, and they still stand when they sing the national anthem. They don't do that in every industry, in every sport today. So we're blessed to get to enjoy that and have those freedoms. But not only those freedoms, to be with a group of people that desire that. And I think what sometimes in our small industry we don't realize that I got to learn when I started riding horses for people from Chicago and LA that grew up riding the back of their couch and watching Tom Mix and Gene Austria, because these guys would tell me this. They dreamed of riding a horse, but they were city people, and they weren't going to get to do it, and then they entered the sport of cutting, and they bought a cutting horse. And one of my best friends is a gentleman named Mel Blount that played for the Pittsburgh Steelers, a Hall of Fame football player with multiple Super Bowl rings. But if you met Mel Blount today, he just wants to be a cowboy. He just loves to ride a horse. And what we so get to do every day, let us not ever take that for granted, because the whole world, deep down in the whole world, there's somebody out there that just wish they were a cowboy. You know, I thought, you know, Jesus himself proved to us that he was a cowboy when he told his disciples, go in the city and there'll be a broke mare there, but she'll be tied to a colt that's unbroke. Bring me the unbroke one. I believe I'll ride it. If Jesus himself had the heart of a cowboy, we are blessed to get to enjoy and live this lifestyle that we all get to live.
Anything else?
Well, I don't know very many jobs that you, like I was. I get up every morning looking forward to what horse I was catching, what we's going to do. Just excited every day to go do what we did. I never got over that. Still do.
Yeah, you're still cowboying and ranching to this day?
Yeah, I'm actually working for Finch Ranch. Some of you know Andy Wheatley, Finch Ranch Helicopter Service. I take care of his ranch while he's off chasing cows on his helicopter.
Yeah. Well, I think that's about it for time. Thank you all very much for being here listening. We really appreciate it.
Thank y'all.
Yeah, thank you very much.